Throughout the Bible, there are stories where God calls ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary purposes. One of the most striking examples is found in Exodus 3, the story of Moses and the burning bush. This encounter is more than just a miraculous event in history. It is a timeless reminder of God's calling, His guidance, and His power to transform ordinary lives into extraordinary instruments. Moses went from being a shepherd in the wilderness to becoming God's chosen leader to deliver Israel from slavery, showing how divine purpose can radically redirect human destiny. In this script, we will dive into the details of Moses' encounter with the burning bush, examine the meaning of God's calling, and explore the lessons of guidance and obedience that still apply to us today. Each moment of Moses' story reveals deeper truths about how God works in us when we feel most unprepared, reminding us that His strength is made perfect in our weakness. 1. Moses' background, from palace to wilderness. Before we reach the burning bush moment, we need to understand where Moses was in life and how his unique journey prepared him for God's greater calling. Moses had an unusual beginning. Born to Hebrew parents during a time when Pharaoh commanded that every Hebrew baby boy be killed, Moses was hidden in a basket and placed in the Nile River. By God's providence, he was discovered by Pharaoh's daughter and raised in the palace as her son, giving him an education and privilege that none of his people could ever imagine. For 40 years, Moses lived as an Egyptian prince. He was educated, trained, and prepared in ways that no other Hebrew was. Yet deep inside, he knew his true heritage. His identity was conflicted, torn between the splendor of Pharaoh's court and his compassion for his oppressed people. One day, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. In anger and desperation for justice, Moses killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. When word spread, Pharaoh sought to kill him, and Moses fled into the desert of Midian. What seemed like the end of his story was actually the beginning of a new chapter where God would reshape him. There, Moses spent the next 40 years as a shepherd. From the palace of Pharaoh to the solitude of the wilderness, Moses' life took a dramatic turn. He married, raised a family, and likely thought his days of significance were behind him. Yet God was quietly shaping him, teaching humility, patience, and responsibility through the very ordinary work of tending sheep. But God was not finished with Moses. The wilderness was not wasted time. It was preparation for the greater mission that lay ahead, one that would require both courage and deep dependence on God's power.
2. The burning bush encounter.
In Exodus 3, we read that Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, near Mount Horeb. It was an ordinary day, or so it seemed, until God stepped in to interrupt the routine.
Then it happened.
Moses saw a bush on fire, but it was not burning up. The flames danced, but the branches remained intact. Intrigued, Moses turned aside to investigate this strange sight, showing how curiosity can often lead us into divine encounters. That's when he heard it. "Moses, Moses." It was the voice of God calling his name. Moses answered, "Here I am." Those 3 simple words would mark the start of his divine assignment. God told him, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." This command highlighted the sacredness of the moment, reminding Moses that he stood before the Almighty. God revealed himself, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At these words, Moses hid his face, afraid to look at God. The encounter filled him with awe and fear, reminding us of the holiness of God's presence. The burning bush symbolized something profound. God's presence that cannot be consumed, His holiness that transforms everything around him, and His call that interrupts the ordinary with the extraordinary. For Moses, this was not just a vision, it was a life-changing meeting with the living God. 3. God's calling to Moses. God spoke clearly to Moses. He had seen the misery of his people in Egypt, heard their cries, and was concerned for their suffering. He was ready to deliver them, fulfilling promises made generations earlier.
Then came the shocking part.
God told Moses, "So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people the Israelites out of Egypt." Imagine the weight of those words. Moses, the fugitive, the shepherd in the wilderness, was being asked to confront Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler in the world, and lead an entire nation out of slavery. It was a mission far beyond human ability, one that only God could accomplish through His chosen servant. This was God's calling. It was not just about delivering people from bondage, but also about displaying God's power, keeping His covenant, and shaping a people for Himself. But Moses wasn't ready to accept it easily. His years in the wilderness had humbled him, and instead of bold confidence, he felt inadequate. Yet God chooses people not because of their strength but because of their availability and willingness to obey His voice. This call shows us that God's assignments often come when we least expect them. In the middle of ordinary tasks, God interrupts with extraordinary purpose, reminding us that he alone qualifies those he calls. 4. Moses' doubts and excuses. Moses immediately began to doubt. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? His words revealed deep insecurity and fear. Moses remembered his past failure, his fugitive status, and his lack of influence. He felt unworthy, unequipped, and incapable of accomplishing such a task. In fact, he raised multiple objections. He didn't think people would believe him, he worried about his speaking ability, and he simply did not feel strong enough. Yet God's response was clear: I will be with you. God shifted the focus from Moses' weakness to his own strength. Moses didn't need to be extraordinary, he only needed to trust the God who called him. This moment reminds us that God's assignments are rarely about what we can do on our own. They are about his power working through us. Our doubts do not disqualify us, they simply highlight how much we need God's presence. 5. God's assurance and signs. To strengthen Moses' faith, God gave him visible signs. First, he turned Moses' staff into a snake and back into a staff. Second, he caused Moses' hand to become leprous and then healed it instantly. Finally, he promised water from the Nile could be turned into blood as a demonstration of divine power. Each sign was not just a miracle but also a message. The staff represented God's authority, showing that he could use even ordinary tools for extraordinary purposes. The leprous hand represented God's power to afflict and heal. The Nile's transformation symbolized judgment against Egypt's false gods.
Still, Moses hesitated.
He said he was not eloquent and feared speaking before Pharaoh. So God promised to send Aaron, his brother, as a helper. This revealed God's patience and grace, showing that he equips his servants with support when they feel inadequate. Through these signs and assurances, God reminded Moses, and us, that his calling always comes with provision. What he begins, he sustains, and what he commands, he enables us to accomplish. 6. The symbolism of the burning bush. The burning bush itself carries powerful meaning beyond the event. First, it represented the presence of God that does not consume. Though the bush burned with fire, it was not destroyed, showing the eternal nature of God's Spirit. Second, the bush symbolized Israel's suffering in Egypt. Just as the bush burned but was not consumed, the Israelites were afflicted yet not destroyed. God's presence preserved them through hardship. Third, it symbolized God's holiness. Moses was told to remove his sandals, a gesture of humility and reverence before the divine. This moment underscored that encountering God requires purity and awe. Finally, the bush represented transformation. An ordinary shrub became a vessel for God's revelation. Similarly, God takes ordinary people like Moses, and like us, and fills them with extraordinary purpose when we surrender to him. 7. God's guidance in the journey. Once Moses finally accepted the call, God's guidance became his constant companion. From the plagues in Egypt to the crossing of the Red Sea and the wilderness journey, every step was directed by God's hand. God's presence was made visible in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, guiding the Israelites through the unknown. He provided manna for food, water from rocks, and victory over enemies. For Moses, this guidance was a constant reminder that the mission did not rest on his leadership skills alone. It was God leading his people, and Moses was simply the vessel. This truth applies to us as well. When God calls us to something greater than ourselves, he doesn't leave us to figure it out alone. His guidance, wisdom, and provision carry us through every season. 8. Lessons in obedience and trust. The burning bush story teaches us that obedience to God's calling often requires courage, humility, and surrender. Moses had to trust God even when everything seemed impossible. His journey reminds us that God's call is not always convenient. It may take us away from comfort, challenge our weaknesses, and stretch our faith. Yet when we obey, we see his power at work in ways far beyond our imagination. Trust is at the core of this obedience. Moses didn't always understand what God was doing, but step by step, he learned to follow his voice. Each act of trust built deeper faith, proving that God is always faithful to his promises. 9. Application for us today. Moses' story is not just ancient history, it's a living example of how God still calls and guides his people today. Like Moses, we may feel unqualified, afraid, or unsure of ourselves. We may think our past disqualifies us or that our weaknesses make us unusable. Yet God specializes in using the unlikely for his glory. He may not call us to deliver a nation from slavery, but he does call us to shine his light in our families, workplaces, and communities. The same God who spoke through the burning bush still speaks today through his word, his spirit, and the circumstances of our lives. Our challenge is to listen, trust, and obey, knowing that his presence will always go with us.
Conclusion.
The story of Moses and the burning bush is more than a dramatic moment of history. It is a picture of God's calling, his holiness, and his unshakable guidance. Moses went from prince to fugitive to shepherd, only to be called into one of the greatest missions in history. His journey shows us that God does not call the qualified, he qualifies the called. When God interrupts our ordinary with his extraordinary purpose, he reminds us that his presence makes all the difference. Just as he was with Moses, he promises to be with us. Our task is to respond with the same words Moses first spoke, "Here I am." Because when God calls, even the wilderness becomes holy ground, and even the weakest vessel can carry his greatest plans.